So last year when we talked in May 2020, the coronavirus was still fresh. It was hardly to accurately assess the situation. Back then, I specifically asked you about civil liberties, and you stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that although the government can be justified in some of its measures to ensure the protection of health and safety for its citizens, it is vital for citizens to remain vigilant during these times as these laws could become permanent. By the way, just as a side note, the video that I'm referring to was immediately taken down by YouTube. Anyways, getting back to the issue, now almost 19 months later, we're seeing a completely different landscape. In many countries, digital vaccine IDs have been implemented that involve the corporate sector. We are seeing measures such as COVID passports and vaccine mandates being instituted. In Germany, for example, restrictions to many public jobs or services are being expanded to only vaccinated or those who have recovered from COVID-19. Chomsky even stated that unvaccinated people should voluntarily isolate themselves and food supplies is their own problem. In essence, for good or bad reason, we have a divided society. What is your assessment of the situation now? Is the government justified or do you think it has gone too far?
I think I would say that with any kind of questions involving a conflict between public safety on the one hand and civil liberties or government power on the other, a good framework to use is what happened after 9/11, in part because it was such a vivid example from which we've all learned so many lessons. Maybe it's also because it was the event that propelled me to leave the practice of law and start writing about politics. And so it's the starting point I use. But what happened there, I think, is very instructive, which is there really was an actual threat that was invoked to justify what was done after 9/11. The threat of terrorism was real. There were two passenger jets flown into two enormous office buildings in downtown Manhattan. It killed 3,000 people. Another was flown into the Pentagon. There was a fourth that was shot down. There have been terrorist attacks over the years that have involved mass casualties in the United States and outside. So it wasn't that the threat was fake. It wasn't that it was not something we should be concerned about. The question was, are we allowing the government to go too far in exaggerating the threat and claiming powers for too long a period of time that exceed the actual threat? And I think most of us concluded the answer was yes. And so many of the things that happened right after 9/11 that we were told were going to be temporary just until the crisis was controlled, things like the Patriot Act, but many other examples as well, are still with us 20 years later, even though there's basically no more Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden is dead, ISIS is defeated. So I think the lesson is that once you empower governments and states and officials and other power centers to obtain authorities in the name of fighting a particular threat or crisis, they don't go away. And here we are at the end of 2021 now. The interview we did was 18 months ago, and not only are all of those powers I was worried about back then still with us, we're talking about even greater powers still, more lockdowns, talking about people who refuse to comply with health protocols being separated from society, denied jobs, and denied the right to travel. And what's amazing about that is when we did our interview, and I was worried back in June or whatever it was of 2020, there was no vaccine, there were no treatments, we understood very little about the virus. Here we are 18 months later, where by far the most important thing that has changed is that there's a vaccine that's universally available that really does protect you against serious sickness and death in almost all cases. And yet there's almost like no recognition that that is a very significant change. And I think that shows you that a lot of times this inertia just continues on its own. As for the question of how we treat the unvaccinated and the Chomsky idea that they ought to be basically put in camps, that's more or less what he said. They ought to be isolated and shunned and just prevented from doing anything other than leaving this physical space. And then kind of at the end, he said, I guess we should bring them food the way we bring prisoners food. But other than that, they should be denied every right and every privilege. I think it makes no sense from any kind of perspective of morality or ethics or science for two reasons. One is that if you believe in the efficacy of the vaccines, as I do, I believe that my being vaccinated protects me from serious illness, let alone death. There's no reason why I should view the unvaccinated as a danger or as a threat. To whom are the unvaccinated a danger? If you believe in the vaccine, they're not a danger to vaccinated people. So why do you need to fire them and punish them and put them in camps? Secondly, if you're worried about people transmitting the virus to you, we know that people who are vaccinated often do contract COVID anyway and transmit COVID. There's more and more breakthrough cases. I think in several states in the United States, 25% of all COVID deaths are vaccinated people. It stands to reason that even a higher percentage of the cases are vaccinated people. So given that vaccinated people can get and transmit the virus to us along with the unvaccinated, what is the reason we ought to continue to look at the unvaccinated as these threats, as these people who need to be punished and deprived basic rights? I think it's really become this kind of like almost punitive approach, like this almost religious fervor that people who are vaccinated are clean and blessed and good, and the people who disobey and don't get the vaccine are sinful, are dirty, are disease carriers. Really dangerous kind of rhetoric. If we look at how that rhetoric has been used in history, and it's increasingly concerning me.
Many progressive organizations in Germany's primary task is to weigh the pros and cons of government policies have voiced little to no concern when it comes to the cons. In other words, the negative effects on society due to the government lockdown or vaccine mandates. On your platform, you looked at the history of government public vaccine campaigns, voluntarily and forced mandates. What were you able to uncover?
So I think that if you look, politicians who have been in favor of vaccine mandates and implement them in various cities bizarrely celebrate the success, in the sense that if you tell people the only way they can keep their jobs in the middle of a pandemic is if they obey, there's going to be a large number of people who obey because they're afraid of losing their jobs and not being able to support their family. That makes sense. That kind of coercion might work in the sense that you get people to do what you want, but it's a very brute tool. It's a really coercive weapon to tell people that the only way they're allowed to have a job or travel or leave their homes is if they obey the health mandates of the state. So, you could round up every citizen if you want who's unvaccinated and forcibly vaccinate them. That would get the population to 100% vaccinated. But I don't hear many people favoring that because we realize that there has to be a balance between people's liberty and the public health. And as I said before, given that I don't see any reason any longer to view the unvaccinated as a danger in a post-vaccinated world, what is the rationale to force people to take a vaccine, whether it's physically using the police to inject their arms or against their will, or being almost as coercive by telling them that they can't work if they don't take the vaccine? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It might work, as I said, in the sense that you get people to comply, just like sending the police to their house would work. But I think it's a really grave infringement of people's liberty to force them to inject into their bodies a substance that they don't want. There may be times when it's justified if it's a highly contagious disease that cannot be transmitted by people who are vaccinated, but that's not the case here. Or if it's a disease for which there's no effective vaccine, you could force people to engage in public health measures to avoid contaminating other people. That's also not the case. So yeah, I'm becoming increasingly worried about this coercive mentality, which, as I said before, we're creating new bureaucracies. If you look at every university, every company, they now have 5 to 10 to 20 COVID officials, Office of COVID Management. Once you start creating bureaucracies like that, it never goes away. So even if tomorrow there was an actual cure for COVID, you could easily see these bureaucracies turning into, say, the Office of Infectious Diseases and continuing to assert the same powers in the name of public health generally, maybe the flu, maybe other coronaviruses. I think what we're doing is very reactionary, and I think it's being done by telling people they can't look at the other side of the ledger, that the only thing that counts is avoiding COVID, and all of the other costs that come from things like school shutdowns and societal disruptions, we shouldn't assign those any value.
In Germany, your opinion would be perceived by many who support government policies as being anti-vax, and therefore immediately fall into the conspiracy theory realm. In the worst case, you could be labeled as supporting an opinion that is killing or promoting the far right, killing people or promoting the far right. Can you talk about the term anti-vax, the double speak involved, and what it actually means or should mean?
Yeah, it's bizarre. I'll just give you I'll use myself as an example, but then I'll give you another one. I went on many shows, some left-wing shows, some right-wing shows before I was vaccinated, while I was waiting for the vaccine to be available in Brazil for people of my age. And I said every single time I went on shows, including Fox News, that I believe in the vaccine, that I intend to be vaccinated the first day it's available for me, that I encourage other people to be vaccinated when they in fact ask me for my opinion. When I was vaccinated, I went on social media and those same shows and I said, I've now been vaccinated and I got my first dose, I got my second dose, I got my booster. So I'm somebody who has been vaccinated, who has repeatedly affirmed my belief in the science of vaccines, who has publicly encouraged others to be vaccinated. And yet I can't tell you how many times I've been labeled anti-vax because I don't believe that the state should be forcing other people to be vaccinated. It's similar to people claiming that if you believe someone should have the right to express an opinion, it must mean that you share that opinion. I think most rational people have come to understand that defending the right of somebody to express a certain opinion doesn't signify you agree with that opinion. It's obviously the same in this case. The fact that I don't support forcing people to be vaccinated doesn't mean I'm against the vaccine. It means that I believe in the right to choose. For me, and my own view is that I very much believe in the science of vaccines. And just recently in the UK, we had a very similar example with Jeremy Corbyn, one of the most admired and beloved figures politically on the left internationally, who came out against two different measures sponsored by the Conservative government of the United Kingdom, by the Tory Prime Minister Boris Johnson, one of which was to force public healthcare workers to be vaccinated or to lose their jobs, and the other was to require vaccine passports for anyone who wants to enter large events. And Corbyn was opposed to both, in part because the unions, which he listens to, as he should, as any leftist would, said, we don't believe our workers who have been on the front line fighting this virus for the last 18 months should be forced to get a vaccine. Some of them have natural immunity from having gotten COVID. Some of them are young, but they should not have their jobs conditioned on getting a vaccine. Jeremy Corbyn is somebody who has gotten vaccinated publicly. He's done public service announcements urging people to get vaccinated. And yet he now, too, is being called anti-vax simply by virtue of opposing this forced obligatory government power. I think what's extra ironic about it is that I think the people who are anti-vax are the people who keep insisting that we can't return to normal, who keep insisting that we need the government to fire everybody who's not vaccinated. The reason why I think we're ready to return to greater normalcy, the reason why I don't look at the unvaccinated as threats to me is precisely because I believe in the vaccine. I believe the vaccine protects me from COVID. I actually believe that. That's why I got the vaccine. That's why I encouraged others to get it. The people who seem to me to be disseminating an anti-vax message are the people who keep saying we can't go back to normal yet. We have to keep schools closed. We have to restrict travel. We have to treat the unvaccinated as dangers. They're the ones who seem to be saying that they don't really believe in the vaccine and its ability to keep us safe. And they go around calling everybody anti-vax as like a weapon. You know, it reminds me a lot of the way people call everyone who criticizes Israel anti-Semitic as a weapon to force them into agreement. That's how anti-vax is used. Anyone who disagrees with me is anti-vax. I think I have the most pro-vaccine message, not just because, like Jeremy Corbyn, I got vaccinated, I'm encouraging others to get it, but because all of my policy views on how we should treat the pandemic are based in the view that the vaccine works.
Usually the left, even if they supported certain government policies, always kept its criticism on corporate influence and structure that influence its policies. So just to quote some random examples, even though leftists don't advocate against driving trains or using cell phones or laptops, they voice criticisms on corporations that produce these goods. And the similar thing is with this vaccine. I mean, there's one thing to talk about the science, and there's one thing to talk about the corporations that are producing the vaccine. And if I take it one step further, when a natural disaster like COVID occurs, market conditions naturally change, which could lead to the formation of natural monopolies, oligopolies, cartels. Leftists would traditionally, in this case, argue for the government to step in, nationalize these industries to ensure that no exuberant profits are made, and that power does not accumulate in the hands of a few corporations that could lead to more political power. However, in the case of COVID, we see the left totally silent on these parts of the political economy and developments of big pharmaceutical companies. And if you now criticize these big pharmaceutical companies, you're calling conspiracy theories. No differentiation is made between the goods produced and the political and economic structures behind these big pharmaceutical companies. Why do you think the left is so afraid and has abandoned its criticism of the political economy surrounding big pharma and the immense power it has accumulated?
It's a great question. It reminds me a lot of what happened during the Trump years, when the entire scandal that dominated the headlines for 4 years in the United States and parts of Western Europe about the threat from Russia, about the collusion between Trump and Russia, emanated from the CIA. It was a CIA created story. They're the ones who leaked it. They're the ones who disseminated it in partners with the NSA and other security state agencies. And yet in major parts of the left, it became off limits to express skepticism of that story. You weren't allowed to express skepticism of claims emanating from the CIA or even question their intentions. The hero of the left became this former director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, who was George Bush's FBI director after 9/11. He was the one who rounded up Muslims in the United States. He was the one who advocated for the invasion of Iraq, claiming that there was definitive evidence of these were the people who we were told we had to get behind and cheer for, and that questioning them was off limits. Now you have Pfizer and Moderna, some of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And I'm not saying we should immediately discount what they're saying, but we should recognize that they have an enormous profit motive in not only hyping the vaccine and all of its benefits, but now insisting that not just the 2 shots we were originally told were needed to make us fully vaccinated, but the 3rd booster, the 4th booster, what's certainly going to be the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th, are all necessary as well to be considered fully vaccinated. The question you asked me before about how we treat the unvaccinated, if you 3 months ago, the unvaccinated meant something different than it means today. The unvaccinated 3 months ago meant somebody who has not gotten 2 shots. Now it means someone who has not gotten 2 shots plus the booster. 3 months from now, it's going to mean somebody who hasn't gotten 4 shots. And there seems to be almost no space on the left to wonder whether or not claims that are emanating from big pharmaceutical companies and their allies in the public health and scientific industry are to be doubted or questioned. And also what you pointed out, that during the pandemic, the story of the pandemic has been that the largest corporations have consolidated their wealth. You can use any metric. The top 200 billionaires in the world have had their wealth tripled or quadrupled because the largest corporations, which they founded and owned, like Amazon and Google and the rest, have all grown dramatically because of our reliance on them, while small businesses have increasingly disappeared as a result of lockdowns and quarantines and economic disruption. So the oligarchy that we already had prior to the pandemic is infinitely stronger than it was 2 years ago as a result of all these restrictions. We're becoming weaker and weaker in terms of our ability to challenge these corporate giants. And yet the ethos seems to be, don't question any of that. Our enemies are not big corporations, big pharma, big government, or the security services. Our enemies are, ordinary citizens who, for whatever reason, don't want to get the vaccine. Those are the people we're supposed to hate and focus on. And for everybody else, obedience, submission, and gratitude are what we owe. And it seems to be a very aggressive inversion of leftist values to me.
We asked the public to send in some questions, and one question is here from Facebook. It says, last year, Professor Chomsky, you said in an interview, and I'm paraphrasing here, that unvaccinated people should not be forced, but should isolate themselves voluntarily, and quote, food is their problem. Are you still of that opinion, given that the vaccine has been shown to be only for self-protection and not for the protection of others, particularly when it comes to the Omicron variant?
Unvaccinated people are free to do whatever they want, except harm others. Nobody has the right to walk around with an assault rifle and shoot randomly. That's not freedom. Similarly, if some business, say a restaurant, decides they want customers to be masked, they have a right to do that. They have a right to protect themselves against people who want to feel free to harm them. So therefore, people who don't want to be vaccinated are perfectly free to do whatever they want, except to violate restrictions where people try to defend themselves. Like the workers in a restaurant have a right to defend themselves against people who want to come in and infect them. It's as simple as that. I don't see, it's true that it aroused a huge furor, more sign of the irrationality. In fact, the whole anti-vaccine hysteria that's developed, mainly in the United States, but also in Germany and elsewhere, is another sign of the growing radical irrationality. There's simply virtually no doubt that the vaccines are very effective. In fact, it's a triumph of contemporary science. And the stories about the harm that they do to you is unbelievable nonsense. You know, they're implanting a chip into you that's going to allow Bill Gates to control you. It's one thing after another. It's, of course, there's an element of uncertainty. That's life. There's an element of uncertainty about anything. But the evidence is simply overwhelming about their positive effect. Every national academy in the world, every academy of science, without any exception, every medical journal in the world, without any exception, I think all just take this for granted. But there's a big popular movement saying we don't believe anything. Actually, that has part of its roots in the neoliberal assault against the population, that's 40 years of a major attack on the general population. And it's led, just to give you some figures, in the United States, there was a study by the highly respectable RAND Corporation, quasi-governmental investigation corporation. They studied the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population, working class, middle class, transfer of wealth to them, from them to the top 1% during the neoliberal years. Their estimate is about $50 trillion. That's pretty effective highway robbery. And it's had an effect all over the United States, all over Europe, with the same things, not to that extent, but similar things have been happening. It's led to anger, resentment, distrust of authority, distrust of government, undermining of democracy. The anti-vaccine hysteria is one lethal aspect of that.
Seems we got another question from the public, again about COVID. This time someone's asking, Professor Noam Chomsky, given all the costs that the economy, that the children, that the businesses, and everybody had to face, do you think that the COVID measures were to some degree an overreaction by the government, or did you consider them to be adequate?
price on the economy. Doesn't have to be much of a price on the economy. Take New Zealand, which imposed maybe the harshest measures in the Western world. Economy did fine. In fact, it improved because the pandemic receded, it was controlled, people could get back to normal life. My feeling is the measures weren't strict enough. If they were done, I mean, it's kind of a rule in the United States and to some extent Europe that you have to denounce China for everything. So one of the things we have to denounce China for is that there are a few thousand deaths. In the United States, 1 million deaths. And China has 5 times the population. So per capita deaths are minuscule as compared with the United States. So we have to denounce China for the policies it used to save a couple of million people. Well, that's the way a deeply indoctrinated society works. But as far as the measures were taken, some of them were probably mistaken. Remember the situation. When the COVID epidemic came, nobody knew much about it. You had to take experimental measures to see what would work. And some of the experimental measures were wrong, naturally. But most of them were basically correct and probably should have been done more strenuously.